Okay, so the revamp schedule for today is that I'm going to talk for a few minutes about assimilation, and then Wenix will do her presentation on natural resources, and then we'll lunch. And during lunch, we'd ask you at your tables in your talk to think of some questions that then after lunch you could ask questions of Wenix or of other people here. Although Rebecca's not here, Nez Perce tribe is represented by Fisheries Department. Maybe we'll get an update on the co-host situation or something. But anyway, we'll have general discussion, and then we've got an evaluation thing we'd like you to fill out. And then Kathleen wants to do a little wrap-up. Okay, so my shtick today is about assimilation. My mentor, Alvin Josephi, said that when the Europeans came to America, to the Americas, the Indians had three choices. Move, get out of the way, which eventually became the removal policy enacted in law, and get out west, get away from us, to Indian territory or to reservations, get away from us. Second alternative, assimilation, become white. Josephi says that both from a governmental point of view and from a societal point of view, most often the assimilation policy has held the fore. And the third alternative for Indians was what? Die. Okay? Move, assimilate, or move, become white, or die. Okay. I'm going to take you through a brief thing. And Albert was going to address some of this last week, but he got involved with their own, the exile and the relationships, intertribal relationships. Here is just a very brief thumbnail of assimilation policy and actions as they applied to the Western tribes, and especially the Plateau tribes here. In 1868, Grant, then president, thought that the Indians had been treated badly, and so he had a peace policy. And he formalized and basically gave administration of the Indian reservations to the churches of the United States. Josephi says this is the greatest breach of the church and state division in our history. Churches had already been on the reservations as missionaries, but now they became formalized as the Indian agents were also the preachers and the churches. Now the Catholics, who had been vigorous, Grant pulled some of the Catholic reservations and gave them to the Methodists and Presbyterians and stuff. But they were all churches. Nez Perce Reservation was Presbyterian. Umatilla Reservation was basically Catholic?
Catholic, both.
Both, okay. Okay. During that period, Grant's guys, Monteith, no relation to James, we think, tried to give half of the Wallowas back to the Indians and had a treaty in 1873 for the roaming Nez Perce Indians of the Wallowas. That was rescinded, but it forestalled some immigration for a while. Okay, the missionaries, of course, think that Christianizing and assimilating and making Indians white is going to be their road to survival. The outward manifestations, the biggest one were the boarding schools. 1879, the boarding schools start. Carlisle. 1880 is Chemawa here, and I think our people probably mostly went to Chemawa, Wenix. Some went to Carlisle.
Some went there, some were shipped down to Oklahoma, some were, they were shipped all over, but majority was at Chemawa. And then afterwards, like now you have the kids that they continue to go. Some of them go to Chemawa or they go all the way down to Riverside.
To Riverside in California, yeah. Okay, but the Indian schools, what they did, those boarding schools, they wanted the Indians to learn a trade, a craft. They were blue collar. They didn't think that Indians could be professionals. They could be housekeepers and nurses and barbers and that kind of thing. In 1880, there were what we call civilization regulations. They told these missionaries on the reservations, go ahead and outlaw dances, drums, regalia, language, anything you want. And they did it. Some more on one reservation than the other. But they basically, people actually buried or hid their regalia to keep them away. And remember we talked about the powwow as it was the 4th of July? That was an Indian trick. We can bring out our regalia on the 4th of July and they'll think we're trying to be Americans, which they did and they still do in many places. In 1881, the Indian Appropriation Act ended treaty making. No more treaties. Okay. And the Indians became wards of the federal government, basically. They were not, by the way, citizens until the path to citizenship was 1887, the Dawes Act or the Allotment Act. If Indians would take the 160 acres or 80 acres for an individual, prove up on it, they could become citizens of the United States. Now, the Allotment Act also, the people did the math. They could give away the 160 acres. The acreage that was not given, that was not allotted, was then free to be sold to white settlers. Okay? They also, the land was to be held in trust for 25 years before an individual Indian could sell that land. He was supposed to learn to be a farmer, by he or she, by that time. But that was too long in some cases, so there were amendments that would make it possible for white guys to buy that land before the 25 years were up. So that policy, those policies, by the way, that whole civilization regulations, they go on until, they're not rescinded until 1936. Termination policy in the Eisenhower years, let's finish this Indian thing once and for all. We're going to buy out all the Indians. We're going to terminate all the tribes. And that was the former governor of Oregon, Doug McKay, was the head of the Department of the Interior, and it's his job to carry out that policy, and he made Oregon an example. So more tribes were terminated in Oregon than the rest of the country combined. The most famous one are the Klamath, right? But there were all these little tribes in the Willamette Valley that were terminated. They've since reestablished as confederated tribes, the Grand Ronde, etc. But they were all terminated. That was piled on by an Indian Relocation Act. A lot of this stuff was done by do-gooders, right? They said, General Pratt said about the Indian schools, we kill the Indian to save the man. So we got to rub the Indian out of him to save the individual. So in 1956, they decided they'd take the young people from the reservations, give them a bus ticket and a couple $100 and an enrollment in a school, and send them to designated cities. So the urban Indian population we have now is the remnants of the Relocation Act of 1956. In 1969, Nixon is elected president. Nixon is the favorite president of American Indians. The termination policy really wasn't working. Again, Alvin Josephi was asked by the Nixon administration to form a committee and look into the Bureau of Indian Affairs. He said, I don't need a committee, you've had plenty of them. And he wrote in 3 weeks, wrote a 90-page report, and the first thing he said is, put a nail in the coffin of termination. Nixon made a speech in 1970 where he famously said, there will be no further termination of Indian tribes, there will be self-determination for Indian people. Okay? So I think when it's the real turnaround where you start to, is with Nixon, believe it or not. Okay? And the next thing that happens in '74 is the Bolt decision. The Bolt decision on the fish in the Northwest. It gives Indians, do you know that there were wars here There were wars by the State Fish and Game in Washington and Oregon with tribal peoples who were trying to fish under the treaty regulations of their treaties. That bolt decision was a lightning bolt. And it's the reason that you guys are working for Nez Perce Fisheries now. Because that decision, that put Indians into the mix on natural resources.
Rich, can you actually describe exactly, in a couple sentences, what that decision said?
What the decision said, Judge Bolt did a bunch of research and went back and looked at the 1855 treaty. And the 1855 treaty said that the Indians shall have the right to fish and hunt in common with the citizenry on unclaimed lands. Unclaimed lands meant government lands or lands that hadn't been claimed. Judge Bolt did a lot of research, and he said in 1855 what in common meant was share equally. Okay? So the Bolt decision says that basically the Indians have the right to half the fish on the Columbia River, half the fish in the Puget Sound. Okay? We have the Intertribal Fish Commission now, which Jamie Pinkham, who's Nez Perce, is the executive director of, and they negotiate these people every year. The Nez Perce Fisheries goes in the state of Washington, the state of Oregon, and they sit down and look at it, and they're not shooting at each other, which they were in 1974. Finally, I'll just say that Wenix was just talking about how the boarding schools lost a generation of knowing how we used to parent. The Indian Child Welfare Act of 1978 said that, no, you just can't, white guys just can't go and grab Indian children off of reservations and adopt them, which in some cases happened. And so they had to try to find Indian families for Indian children, etc. That's followed the same year by the Indian Freedom of Religion Act. As Alvin used to say, until 1978, Indians in America, you could be a Muslim, you could be a Hindu, you could be a Christian, you could be a Jew, and you had religion. But if you were in Indian, Alvin said you had mumbo jumbo. Wasn't religion until 1978. So that turnaround, it starts in 1970, and Wenix and her people are rapidly trying to catch up with how many generations lost to this huge attempt to turn brown people into white people. And the final, one of the newest books out on the Nez Perce is Thunder in the Mountains. It's a dual biography of General Howard and Chief Joseph. And he makes the point that Chief Joseph spent his entire career trying to understand white people and the white power structure. At no time did the white power structure try to understand Indians. But that's changing, and we're part of the change right here. Right, Kathleen? Okay. The boarding schools, I showed this, had a couple of, this is just a 2 or 3 minute deal, but a class I taught at the college in LeGrand, of all the things they saw or talked about the whole semester, after they saw this little clip on the boarding schools, the students came up to me and said, "We did that?"
The coercion was real. You either sit in the school, you could find yourself in jail, or the government would just take it.
Something was wrong with me, but I couldn't function like what I thought a human being should.
Every time we tried talking about his boarding school years, he reached the same block.
Like so many, I have lived a life blocked by fear, led by fear, and governed by fear that was created in those childhood days.
What they were trying to do was turn us into a white man, but still they couldn't do it.
Never knew what kind of a beating was coming. We did didn't see it as abuse. I didn't even know the word as abuse.
If you don't learn how to live with it, you just blank it out. And then all of a sudden you start talking about it, and you can't remember because you blanked it out so damn many times.
Is it any surprise then that they become abusers? Violent abuse, sexual abuse, psychological abuse, all of the things that were done to them, they're going to carry out on the next generation.
My own children, I'm estranged from them simply because I never figured out how to be a father, or even how to be a human being.
You have a culture that survived near genocide on its knees, and then you pluck a child out of this family and everything that's kept them alive.
If you could destroy the Indian society at its roots, which is the family, then you destroy the society.
I didn't know the medical words, so I called the problem what I felt it to be, the thick, dark fog.
It took us 4 years before we finally came to the end of what he had to say.
Tatsmewi inam latua kahimyuma inam wanakisa Wenix wawukia out. My name Wenix means echoing through a mountain canyon as it rises from the ground. My last name is Red Out, which is wawukia out. I am from the Wallowa band people. From my grandmother's side, I'm also from the Looking Glass band, and Jackson Sundown was my family. I'm enrolled in Umatilla, but I'm mostly Cayuse, Nez Perce, Umatilla, Colville, Ojibwe Cree, and I'm part white. And when you were talking about, you struck something with me when you were talking about the assimilation. My grandma spoke 7 languages. Not one of us kids know those languages. And I remember sitting in the kitchen and listening to her and my dad speak. And she was born in about 1912. And I had an old grandmother, she had her kids later in life. She had 6 miscarriages before she was able to actually have babies. She didn't have kids until in her 40s. Which kind of is funny because I'm the same way. I have my daughter and I'm 43 and she's just 3. So our family's older, all our relatives are older. We have those older teachings, and my dad told my mom, teach them to be white, because we do not want them to be beaten the way we were for speaking their language. Or at that time, it wasn't popular to follow those practices. It took a long ways for us to be here today. The work that we're doing as a tribe for our first foods, and even presenting like the way our tribe presents and the way we share about our culture, and we share heavy about our culture in a way that most tribes don't, because their elders tell them not to. And when we started moving towards our first foods mission, which is this Autni Tequeta, Autni talks about a holy, sacred food from the beginning of time of how creation came forward. And a lot of those teachings we keep really personal because of biopiracy, or cultural things that are taken, even the knowledge about sharing how those foods are, and going out and showing these are our foods, this is what they look like. Our people were scared of that. Our elders were scared of that, telling us don't share those things. But we're at a place that we have to document them. We have to record them. We have to go out there and do education and outreach, because we have lost it. And every single tribe has seen loss related to the foods, fishing sites, cultural sites that they used to go to. We have all seen loss. And so now is the time that we have to all think in a different way of how are we going to retain what we have. And this is what our tribe is working for. So I'll be presenting on kind of what we're doing towards that.
So when we talk about how Department of Natural Resources for the Confederated Tribes is managed, it's based on Tumanwat, our cultural law, or Nez Perce Tamowood. And so within that, we all have our own creation, and those creation stories are really specific to the place of those tribes, because all the foods come in a different order. All those things come in a little bit different way, and no tribe is right than the other, because those are their teachings. Those are the way those foods have come forward for them. So the best one to really go over what that law is one of our elders, teachers. His name's Thomas Morning Owl, and we currently worked on a video called Wisdom of the Elders that the producer just sent me the video and said, this is what we did. I'm like, oh, I almost forgot that we did that. And there's a part of it where Thomas is telling about that creation story. And he goes, we just got more money. We want to extend it to be over an hour. And so we're still working on it. And I said, can I use this? And so I'm hoping it will queue up for us, because I've never seen it done the way it's done in this video. It's just really good. But this is how we lead our management approach. So we're gonna go ahead.
Does it need the video, I mean the audio, like the last one?
It's going to. Yeah, it's gonna need that.
Yeah, I got audio.
Let's see. Okay, I hooked into it earlier, so.
That's this. This is the one. Yeah, so it says connected. So.
I've never had any sweet presentations or some presentations like that.
I was hoping I would do it, but it's not strong enough. So I'm gonna tell you how I tell my kids, because it's a really long creation story, but this is kind of how I reiterate it for my students. I do a lot of outreach throughout the year. I usually outreach to about 6,500 people a year. In the last 10 years, I've outreached to about 50,000. They send me all over the place. I just love to talk, so. When the Creator was creating, He was creating the universes, the stars, the galaxies. He was placing everything. And in that place of creation, He was creating Earth.
and he took a ball of mud, and he formed it and formed it and formed it, and then he blew life into it. And as he blew that earth, it became bigger and bigger and bigger. And during this time, there was a lot of different things that were going on. He was breathing different colors into the earth, different colors into the people, different things that had all meaning. And as the earth became bigger and it was formed, he created formations, and then he placed the water, the plants, the animals, and all those things resided on the earth. And when they were residing on the earth, they all knew their place. They all knew how to give themselves to each other in a way that those populations would continue to be sustainable. And with that creation, he was creating man and woman, and he placed them both down, and they both were on one side. And the Creator said 7 words of creation, and all of his creation stood. And in that council where they were all at, all of his creation stood forward to the men first. And it was the Nusach who stood up first, and he represents all the aquatics. And they all stood in line in the order that they come. And the Nusach said he would sacrifice his body for the people and give himself, all his self, to them. And he named different parts of his body for different things. The oil for the ears. You know, there's different parts within the head, within the cheek. There's different things that have different nutritional values that can heal the body. And he named those things there during this time. And he said, in return, what I ask of you is that when I come back to the rivers, that you'll take me in, you'll do a ceremony for me and thank us for coming back to you. You celebrate our lives. And so every year, we have the salmon feast. After the Nusach, it was all the other species they gave their testimony to. He was the leader for them. The next one to give testimony was the Amish, the deer, and the deer stood. When the deer stood, they said they would give their body for nourishment. And they also give their hides for clothing, for lodging, their bones for tools. And they also named multiple other places, different things within their body, and every single thing within their body had a name. And our elders used to know all those things. Had medicinal uses too regarding certain things in their body, and our elders knew all those things. A lot of that knowledge is lost. After the Amish gave testimony, he said with his hide, that is the gift of the drum. And that drum represents all heartbeat of all living things and our Mother Earth. She is moving and living and has that lifeblood. And she also has a tectonic pulse. After all the animals gave their testimony, the Creator said 7 words of creation, and all creation turned to the women. And the roots came forward, and they gave their testimony and talked specifically to the women. After the roots, it was the berries, the wiwinu, the huckleberry. She came forward. The chokecherry is actually the oldest, but the wiwinu in our areas, that's the most beautiful. So as they give their testimony, they ask that in return, that when it is our time, our bodies go back to the ground. Our energy that we have taken from them is transferred back. And in that transfer, our bodies break down and nourish them and give them energy and give them medicine for them. Because every part of those foods are different types of vitamins, different types of things that our bodies need. If they become sick, we become sick. With the loss of our fish, when they were lost through these streams, we lost the language related to those very specific riverways. We lost the teachings related to that place. Every fishing is different, from the big river to the Umatilla to the small streams, and the implements are different. The teachings are different. The stories and the memories of their family and what they were doing, it wasn't also just fishing. They might have been gathering some type of important medicine or something, but we lost that with that. Next. So, for the Umatilla Confederate Tribe, when we signed that treaty in 1855, that basically secured the three tribes together. They did not want to give that treaty to the Umatillas. They weren't going to give it. And they said, no, we're not going to give that treaty. We're not going to give you that homeland. And so that night, they put extra regiment out because they said, you know, they might try to fight against us. And so they had extra people out, and they said in the morning time, they noticed that all the warriors were gone. Everybody was gone, and they looked up on the ridge tops. They had snuck out, and they were all along the ridge tops, all the way around, supporting our tribe. All the warriors from all the different tribes. That's something you don't hear often. Those are stories passed down from our elders. So if they decided to go ahead and give us that part of the land where we reside now, which is on the Cayuse territory, and then we have, it formed the Willilipu, who's the Walla Walla, the Imatilam, the Umatillas, and then the Cayuse, which Cayuse means superior people. And that language is actually gone now, our last speaker. And you know, the Cayuse had the Cayuse Nez Perce, that they say a long time ago that they were solid and they busted a long time ago. Our elders tell us about that. But that's why you have the similarities in those two languages. And so at that time, there was about 1,500 members. There was more than that, but they were all spread out. Not everybody made it down. But currently, we have a little bit over 3,000. And it fluctuates from death to birth. So we had 6.4 million acres that we had to give up. And we ceded that so we could have, so we could retain the rights for hunting, fishing, gathering, harvesting. We never were given anything. We kept those rights to continue to do those things. And so this is kind of a density map, and this is just a kind of example. It's still kind of a little bit drafted out because it should be a little bit more extended than this. So the density area where you see the dark brown, that's kind of the main area of those tribes. But we extended out while we're going all the way over into Montana to go buffalo hunting, up into Canada, along the coast. We actually have lots of stories about them going to the coast because those old grandmas used to love those smoked mussels, and they would trade, they would get all their roots together, and they'd get mad, they said, oh, we'd go down there, and then we'd barely get any of those smoked mussels for all of our couch that we dug. So they talked about like, the differences of what they were getting. And what that trade, because some of the roots and the medicines from here, they don't grow in other places, so those trade networks were very important. We also went all the way down to Salt Lake City. They followed that salt trail all the way down, and then they moved around different places, but this is just kind of an example of the extent of where we were traveling throughout this area. Next. And so in our treaty, it talks about provided also the exclusive right of taking fish in the streams. You're talking about that Bolt decision, and every tribe's treaty is a little bit different. The language is a little bit different. And we're talking about the bordering said reservations hereby secure to said Indians and at all other usual and custom stations in common with citizens of the United States, and erecting suitable buildings for curing the same, and the privilege of hunting, gathering roots and berries, and pasture the livestock and unclaimed lands in common with citizens is also secured to them. Next. Exclusive right of taking fish. That was written within that treaty. Like I said, and everybody's a little bit different in their interpretations. The way we are told is that a lawyer can never, ever interpret a treaty correctly because they are not a language speaker. You have to have a true language speaker because there are words and sayings that cannot be explained in English. You have to think like them when they're trying to do this. And even for our speakers now, it's hard for them to even look in because they have to really know that culture and those teachings to really be able to interpret it how it really should be. And the privilege of hunting, gathering roots, berries, and pasture our livestock. Not a lot of us have livestock, but we do everything else. We do have some people that have that, but not as much. Next. And so what I'm going to talk about is how we've taken that Tamanwat, that first law, and we wrapped our Department of Natural Resources around that. Instead of being guided by science first, how we were, I mean, we had the culture in there, right? But by putting as a mission statement, it helped us be, this is how it's going to be done. And also because a lot of our non-tribal people were having a hard time with that. They're like, well, we're following the mission statement. The first mission statement talked about water and salmon, and they were doing that. And it was really hard for them to wrap around. We're talking about all foods. How does your work related to salmon affect all those foods? When you're doing habitat work, how are you affecting all those foods? And so we make every one of our programs and department, when they do any project, they have a checklist. They have to talk about how are they managing towards this goal. Our mission is to protect, restore, and enhance our tribe's first foods. I'm going to have you say this part with me. The first one is chush. The second one is nosach. The next one is yamash. The next one is chaush. And the next one is wiwinu. For the perpetual, cultural, and sovereign economic of the tribe, we do this by utilizing traditional ecological knowledge first. Tamanwat is the unwritten law, the law of nature. The sun rises in the east and it sets in the west. It never ever diverts that path. Just like the salmon are born in the streams, they're there for a little bit, they go out to the ocean, then they turn around and come back. That is the law Creator gave to them in the beginning. Our people are a food-associated culture. Everything that we do relates to that food, those cultural teachings, the teachings we teach to our children, and the way we relate to them. The way we relate to the land, and the importance of that land, and it is embedded within our DNA. We have been taking in that soil into our mouth, into our soul, and when those foods light up the earth, we light up with them. The work that we do to go out and gather those foods and harvest those foods and do those things, they say that when we're doing that promise, when we turn around and we have to do that promise because we made that in the beginning, that as we start doing that work, our bodies light up for the work we're doing because of the promise that we started. So with this, by using that traditional cultural knowledge, we look at population habitat management goals and actions and how we're going to get there based off our tradition, that knowledge of our elders. Because the best people for us to be able to inform how many fish used to be in these streams is my great grandma who said, my grandma said when we were up there fishing, she said there used to be so many fish you could walk across their backs. You didn't even have to use anything. You could just walk in the stream and selectively pick. They would tell us, take the ones that are all beat up first, and they'd grab them and throw them out, and then they'd knock them over heads on the banks. And they would leave the strongest in there. So we were taught conservation methods from the time we were young children. And as we ran around in the house and they were talking about different foods, they were talking about these things, we didn't even realize that in the background of our head we're hearing them all the time. We also create natural resource policies and regulatory mechanisms to protect those too. So when you're looking at the first food management approach, we were looking at how do we match all that up. And for us, it was already there because the creation already said, the first thing is the water. And so the water is the blood of the people, the blood of the earth, because without that, none of us would be living. And that's the most important. When she's sick, we are all sick. Or he. Water, the aquatic species and the animal species, those are the men's food. So the men, that's the men's work. Today you see kind of women and men kind of doing that work back and forth. A long time ago, they knew how to do those, but that was men's work. And then the women's work was related to the roots and berries. And so we said, you know, we have water rights. They're protected by the treaty, and everything's protected, and this is how we're going to lay it down. Water was first, or we have our water resources. Fisheries program does everything aquatic related, the wildlife for the hunting rights and the deer, range, ag, forestry. They are all the plants. So that's the root-bearing plants, foods and plants, and then the wewenu for the shrub, from the small shrubs all the way to the overstory. So when we're talking about first foods, it's a loaded first foods, because it encompasses every single plant that gave testimony after all of these, and all the culturally significant plants related. Sometimes I've heard people ask us, what is the most important thing? And I asked my elders, what is the most important for a thing to focus? And they said, everything's important because every single thing has a name and a use. And if you take something out, you never know what that impact's going to totally be, because you might not see it now. And one little thing could affect everything, like a domino. We also have the Cultural Resource Protection Program that protects those cultural significant sites that we go and access and do those things, the old villages and the people in the ground, above the ground, and that part of the culture. We have First Foods Policy Program to create policies and help protect the trees and things related to that. We have Education Outreach is me. I do it for all those programs. It's a big job. and the tribe in general, they call me for all kinds of things. Energy and Environmental Science Program, that's a new program that used to be a department that we absorbed. Next. So I'm going to kind of give you an example of how those foods look like, just kind of spaced out of one little area. And that white line represents the Umatilla Watershed Basin. And when you talked about the Dawes-Alama Act, and the land surplus and everything that was happening, we are a prime example. We were the next ones on that cutting block. If he wouldn't have done what he did, we were the next ones on that chopping block that they were going to, cut. So this is our reservation. And as you see it's real blocked off. We lost a lot of land. We're working on establishing that. We have a certain percentage of fund that comes off the casino. That and other monies that come from different places that we're working to put that reservation back as whole as we can. So we're slowly buying. But we also buy other places, like in Dayton, we purchased the rainwater property, Ridgetop to Ridgetop, because it's one of the best birthing areas for big game elk. And we have the Wanakit Wildlife Refuge, where it is all the waterfowl. And so we look at areas that are very significant when they come up, and we talk, does this meet our goals? How can this benefit us? How can we manage it and put it back into wildlife or back into trust? So go ahead and click next. So that white line, Umatilla Watershed Basin, historically all those tributaries had fish. The tributary where you see those fish, for over 70 years in the Umatilla, there was no salmon. And I remember walking those rivers with no salmon. We fished. My brother would wake me up at 5 in the morning to go down fishing, and we would go, and we're like, we'd be down fishing all day long. And I remember there never being salmon. There'd be little trouts, little things, but I remember when they came back, because I was a part of that. And I remember not seeing very many beavers, Never seen no otter. Wasn't very many birds. There was birds, but not very many. But now, last year I seen a flock of eagles sitting behind my house in the tree. I've never seen that ever in my whole entire life. I see an otter walking through my yard. I see all the wildlife coming back, and that's amazing. When you put them back, everything else comes back too, and that is our job. Next. So after the salmon, as you see, we're at the bottom of the lowest elevation, and we start fishing, and then as soon as the roots come, at the end of May for us, it's at the end of April, early May, usually end of April when they're ready for us because it's colder right where we're at. Different tribes, their feasts are at different times because they're all come up a little bit differently depending on elevation and where those tribes are located. And so this just shows the distribution of the roots across the lower Blue Mountains, and then you have the game, and there's so many of them in our area, they're all over the place, literally. And then you have Weewanu, and then as you see that she is actually outside the border of the reservation, she's barely on there. And so when we're starting to harvest, we're starting down low to the lowlands, and we continue to work our way up. And as those foods turn, we continue to go to something else. And so when we're getting Weewanu, we're elk hunting, we're gathering that, we're gathering the medicines, and we're up in the mountains doing those other practices that you do in those areas. Next. And so if you looked at a tribal table, if you came to our longhouse, the foods are sent in specific order, and in that order you have the water, the salmon, the deer, the roots, the berries, and basically that is if you look at it in ecological processes, they're set in their species sets. So for example, were the salmon set first? And it depends, like when you're at the longhouse, it depends what comes into the longhouse. Whoever brings in food, whatever they bring in, you're like, okay, well, somebody brought salmon, someone brought stillhead, someone brought eel, someone brought this, someone brought that. And then the cook's job is to make sure that when those foods go out, they set it in the order that it's supposed to go as those foods came up. So we had a big feast. It was one of the biggest feast I've ever seen in my lifetime, and most of the elders said they have ever seen. And it was for Atwai Chief Carl Sampson, his daughter, wanted to honor her father. She brought 28 foods to that table. There were so many Indian foods, we could not set them down in the order. We had to zigzag them back and forth. So the first thing she had was salmon, and then she had dried salmon, and then they had smoked salmon, and then they had trout, and then they had eel, and then they had, what the heck else was it? The smelt didn't show up, but I thought they had smelt. And then after that, they had elk, and then they had deer, and then they had moose. What else was it? Buffalo. They had goat. They had, she wanted to get the fowl, but they weren't able to get the fowl. And then they had so many roots that I can't even name them all. They had the bitterroot, the luksh, the onipush, the camas, the moss, the cactus. They had as many things. And I was out with her at one place and I said, this is a food too? She goes, that one's a food too? Oh, well, I'm gonna gather enough for my table. And we were going out together, and so when we go out together and we were teaching each other too, and I was like, well, this is the one too, this is the new one. So she goes, I'm gonna gather that too. So what she was doing was she was bringing back food to the table and knowledge to the table that we haven't had in a long time. And we were really excited about that. And a lot of the old elders from all the different tribes that were sitting at that table, I have never heard the conversations at that table the way I did that day. They were talking about, I don't remember this, do you remember this? And they were saying in different languages, and we were all sharing what we knew. And then they're like, oh, one time my grandmother, she had to go like way down there. And then they were bringing back stories that they hadn't remembered since they were children. That's what our food does and our culture does for us. When we're in the thick of it, it brings back those teachings that we forget other ways. Next. So by using that first foods, this is just a really brief example of a few projects, because we have massive projects. I mean, our fisheries, you know, how Nez Perce fisheries too, they're big, their territory is big, and like us, we have lots of different projects. So this is just a kind of a little tiny capstone of what that is. We have created the river vision, which in that vision, we created a vision of how to have a healthy river and what the touchstones are and the key elements of that river vision and how we're implementing it to those projects. Once it was created, now the projects have to implement to those factors. Then we have created lamprey passage, fish harvest agreements. You have habitat acquisition, predator monitoring, which is one of my favorite ones. This big cougar up here. There's a dog called the Esculpa. And their predictions were like 5 times off of how many cougars were actually really in that tributary. And what they've realized that the population of cougars on the Umatilla Reservation is exploded. They're all over. There's so many of them that we have accounts from tribal members saying, I was looking out my window and I seen 9 large cats walking. 4 of them full adults, huge, massive adults with little ones behind them. And every time a tribal member comes in contact with them, they don't come in contact with one. They're getting hunted by one looking down, and they realize there's 2 or 3 more stalking them from the other ends. They're changing their patterns because because we designate seasons. We could let everybody hunt all year round, but we have seasons because we want those populations to come back. So that's how we monitor it in our way. And because of that, usually during hunting season, especially non-hunting season, as soon as that opens up for the non-native hunters, they all run to the res. They just hijack down to the res. And we usually don't go hunting during that time. We stay out of it because it's crazy. We just stay out during that time. And then after they leave, they move back off. We have so many whitetail on our reservation, they have opened up year-round hunting for them, and we can't even put a dent in the population because those suckers are having twins or triplets. Almost every single one you see will be strutting by with a twin, and I think that, you know, over time, they're just twins of twins of twins, and so it just runs in the blood, so they're all over the place. My boyfriend's from Warren Springs, and he said, I've never seen so many flipping deer just walking around. And I was like, I look out the window, I go, hey, look at that buck standing. Let's look at the buck standing on this. We have a little tiny hill that goes in between both of our houses, and we have horses and we have hay. They always come, they'll come in there and eat the apples. He stands on this little tiny hill and he'll have like 10 or 11. And I'm like, oh, you realize there's a hunter in that room and there's a hunter back there, and he like stands straight around in this little thing. And I'm like, look at this. We're working on cutting down our feral horse population. They did a roundup on them because they were really decimating some of the areas where our big game would be grazing. We do repatriation, publications, and then working to educate the community. And so that's just a few examples of that. Next. So this is an example of a river vision, and if you guys want this, I can send a link so you guys can actually have the document because this is published. This is the technical part that usually Eric really gets into, but I don't. It is the Umatilla Basin includes a healthy river capable of providing first foods that are sustainable to the continuity of the tribe's culture. The vision requires a river that is dynamic and shaped not only by physical and biological processes, but the interaction and interconnection between those processes. By taking a look at that, and they have to look at the hydrology, the connectivity, the geomorphology, the riparian vegetation that goes along with a healthy system related to those areas and to those food sources and the aquatics within those waterways. And how it applies to first foods, and how they're all connected. And looking at the springs, the flow of the water, the timing of the water, the channels, and looking at everything, not just fixing the riparian areas, but looking at all those touchstones. Next. We also have Pacific lamprey and freshwater mussel propagation. We have the lab over in Walla Walla Community College, and it's cutting edge because what they're doing there, it's so specific what they're doing there at that lab is that it has never been done in that way in this country. There's only 2 other people that are actually doing the full propagation of both of those from the beginning to the end stages, and I believe the lamprey eel, and those are in Asia. And so, because it's so new and there's not a lot of research out there, they have things that happen that sometimes, they have little kill rates. They have to start all over for the next year when it comes up, and it's pretty amazing. I spend a lot of time over there. I'm currently working with the Wallowa wet labs, so we can do education outreach inside the area around there, so to get more outreach out about that, and we bring a lot of school groups in for tours of that lab so they can see them growing. And what was really funny is because, they kept dying because the water just wasn't established enough for the species. And, some of them are different related to, some of the mussels they need to Chinook, or some of them they can be on any one of those fish because they attach to the gills. And they're very specific, they're very touchy. And so they put some trout in there and they held some salmon in there for a while, and they thought it would establish the water well enough. Well, there wasn't enough of their waste in the water to help have good water, so they had to bring sturgeon in. So they brought a few sturgeon in, a few little guys. And since the sturgeon are in there now, they're able to produce enough waste that's a real healthy water balance for those species so they can do the work that they're doing. But once they brought in the sturgeon, they realized that they can't release those sturgeon because once the sturgeon come back into a laboratory, you can't put them back in the waterways. So now we're like, okay, I guess we're gonna have to be like Bonneville Dam and create some big tanks where we drop those salmon, because when they first came in, they're this big, they're pushing this big now. And so we're working to create some outreach and some areas so we can have the kids be able to view them as they continue to grow throughout their life. They're gonna be there for a long time. So when you're looking at, we really wanted to go back and hunt buffalo in the way that we had. We hadn't done that for over 150 years. We had to fight for that too, because the Montanos was like, no, we're not letting you come. And so we had to use information, traditional ecological knowledge, and the stories from our elders to tell us what they remember. We also, and I was part of the research team, we had to research journals all over the place. They sent us to archives everywhere, looking at little passages that say we ran into cayuse today. We were up here over on the Snake, and we ran into a group of them that had been gone for 2 years. And we hadn't eaten meat so long, we were so tired of fish, and they were trading for that buffalo. And so we were able to gather information from those trapper journals, the Core Discovery, Lewis and Clark, to help us really secure those. Next. So after we won, next, we were able to go back to harvest, and I believe it was, we were going back and forth on this the other week. We think it was about 2011 when they did the first hunt. And we're very excited that we're able to do that. We send our wildlife, we send people with them to make sure that they are, one, they're all right, they're doing what they're supposed to be doing out there, and that they can continue those teaching and those cultural areas, and extend that area of us going to those areas to gather. We actually just told the state that we've been asking them to work with us to try to set up some type of establishment, to establish us to be able to go back and start getting moose in areas that are on, they're off. There are usual and custom areas, and even as we travel up. So I was in the commission meeting a few months ago, and they said, we're tired of asking, we're telling you that next year we're going back no matter what because we're going to practice our rights and nobody's telling us different. So you tell them to get ready, we're coming. So, next. So this is an example of, they're working really hard to do fuel reductions on the reservation because it was just a mess. And we're working with the Umatilla National Forest to, you know, start implementing some different things in those areas and how we can work together. Because our people have been doing fire reduction and using fires from the beginning of time. We used to go in after certain harvest areas, and they used to burn some of the root areas, some of the crop areas. They burn those areas. They would go through after huckleberry season, and they would clear out the area, get it ready, and they would burn. And the whole bands that were there would help in that. There's stories of them when they clear out, they would attach that deer antlers and stuff to teepee poles so they could help kind of, you know, keep things contained. They'd also take the stomachs of an elk or deer, and they would leave the intestine and fill them with water. They basically had their own piss bags way back in the day. You know, firefighters, or people have been doing it for a long time. And after that, it keeps that canopy open, because right now we have those huckleberry fields that they're encroached, the canopy is closing over the top of them. There's a lot of weeds. They're weaker because they don't have the nutrients in the ground to help them be stronger. And so how do we work to, you know, get back to some of that management? And then also open up the area so the big game have more grasses. And so we've been pretty successful in this, and so they're going from one part to one part of the reservation. So when a fire hits us, it's not gonna decimate that stand. It's gonna burn slow, hit those trees. It might take out some of them, but it will go around them. But when they have all that fuel, it just rips through them. So we're working on how can we protect our lands the best we can and work with others to continue to do that. Next. So we have different impacts that come in all the time. You have the wind farms. I mean, first you had the dams, now we have the wind farms, and they're going over areas that we have root fields or bitter root fields that we didn't even know that were there. But through some mitigation, and we helped them kind of put a path where it wasn't as destructive across different cultural sites and different areas. And then also we created some agreements with them. We were able to access that land that we hadn't accessed over 100 years. So every year they let us go back to that area, and we bring out groups of people to go gather in those areas. Next. So we're currently working really hard on creating what's called the upland vision, because everybody knows that it isn't also the lowlands. You have to think about what's going on upland, because everything up flows down. And so how do we manage in the better from the bottom of the system all the way to the very top? And this is what we're doing. So we're working on creating this vision to create benchmarks, planning tools for all those resources in the mountains in those areas, and identify the touchstones related to the animal sources out there, our big game, to the different plants, the food plants related to us, and the culturally significant plants that we use. And all of it, how can we do a good way of protecting all those? Because we don't have good protections on them. Our huckleberries are getting hammered every year, and just in some cases they're not coming back like they are, or some years they do well, some years they don't do well. But just because they're so popular right now, and people go in and they're raking those bushes. And when they rake those bushes, they knock off all those leaves. They cannot do their photosynthesis to stay strong because they're ripping them apart. So by the time that a frost comes and a freeze comes, they're not as strong as their root system wasn't able to dig down, and so it kills them. And so how can we protect them better? That's one example. Next. So what we're currently working on, this is my baby, is instead of just doing education outreach to schools and colleges, we are turning around our focus because we're successful. We're bringing these foods back and making them sustainable across the land base. We're doing what we said we're going to do. We're securing these foods so our people can go back out and to practice their treaty rights and have a sustainable food source. And so now that we're there, we are going to be doing what's called First Foods excursions, and we're getting ready to hire a force underneath me. And I will be working with our tribal Yellow Hawk, the health center. We are combining with our language program. We're combining with all the schools, our child services, And we're going to be providing excursions where we're bringing them out. And sometimes we might be focusing on specific groups to bring them out because some are more sensitive than others. And so we're going to bring them back to gathering sites and areas that they haven't accessed in years. We're working really hard with external state, federal agencies, other businesses that are like, you know what, we have some land, we would really like to see your people come back, and are you interested? Yeah, we're interested. Let us get out there and check it out. And then we'll be bringing them to sites where we're doing restoration work or water work, and then they'll be able to tour the site and say, this is what we're doing to protect the food sources, and this is your right to be able to go out and harvest and to keep those traditions. Plus, we've lost so many things. We're working hard to bring those back. And not all families have that knowledge anymore. Some families, they lost that, and so they don't take people out because they don't know how. We have people that were sent out from the boarding schools or sent out on relocation programs to different cities, and they never came home. Or they were foster care out that are finally, we have people that just got enrolled not that long ago that they found out they were from here, and they're like, we want to come home and learn. But they're not close to the family, so we're giving them an opportunity to be able to teach as many as we can. We are building our teachers. And so we're going to be looking at the tribal language. We're going to be teaching them more about their treaty rights, because we have treaty rights, but not all of them know them, and teaching them how to read maps and how not to get in trouble, and to how to follow those things. And so we're going to be having to create a lot of different things related to the work that we're doing. I'm really excited that I get to have a job where I just bring out people to go hunting, to go fishing, to go gathering, to do things, to make nets. What kind of job is that? I'm so happy. Next. So this is kind of an example of a timeline that we set up. And we had to kind of, rough that out, because nothing's ever on time when it's related to natural resources. They come when they want to come. And so you have we have them set out, so you have your project dates, the types, tasks, activities, and where we're going to be accessing them. So this is kind of the way that looks like, for example, May through July, we'll have a first food excursion. We'll be focusing, and we left this really vague because when we write grants, we don't want to be locked down. We want it to be so vague that we have flexibility in them. So we want it to be able to flow across them. And so all the words and everything we do is kind of loose. So you have the lit, the piaje, the luch, the couch, the sawit, the nunas, also the other foods that we're not gathering, and that's one of our biggest focus. So when we take them out, we're going to say, okay, this is this route, but we're going to teach them as many that we see out there and teach them about them as much as we can. We're going to start creating like different booklets for our tribal members. And first we have to focus on the tribal members because they have the rights. And for the education, we're going to have to play with that a little bit, because we have to teach more than just our tribal. We have to teach the other kids that are from Nez Perce tribe or Warm Springs tribe or the other tribe, because their parents might be Umatilla, but they might be enrolled somewhere else. Somebody has to take them out. And so we have policies, especially they're really tight when it comes to fishing and hunting and where you can take them or who can be with you, who cannot be with you. But who's going to teach those kids if their parents can't take them out there? And so we have to create something different to get around that. And so what we're looking at, we have a lot of work to do. We have a lot of legal work to do too to make sure we can do this. But in education, we have some flexibility. So we're going to be working really hard to see what we can do to teach our children, at least from the bottom up. Next. So this is just gathering excursion options. Like I said, we left it loose. And so we have kind of the season, the different species, and then the locations that we might be accessing. So basically, it'll just depend on year and year and the different groups we work with. And as we work with them, we'll be like, okay, well, let's go get this and let's go get that. So we're really excited. And this is kind of where we're going for education and outreach. Next. So like I said, we're a food-associated culture. We have to have the ability to access, to harvest, to prepare, to teach those children, because if we don't have the ability to access salmon and it's not there, we lose that language, that teaching, that that young man can become a fisherman. Because that first fish that he takes, he has that ceremony for that. He becomes a fisherman. If he can't go hunting, he can't become a hunter. And they have a ceremony for that. And once he becomes that fisherman and that hunter, he's that for his tribe for his whole entire life. We belong to our tribes. We're not single. There's no way they can beat that out of us. Because even if we might have grown up like that, you feel lost. Our people they feel lost until they come back and reconnect and they talk about it. People that have been gone and don't know anything, when they come back, they feel like they're becoming whole again. So that's why it's important that we have to fix it, not only as Department of Natural Resources, but we have to work with our people in all ways. And so the sharing, the consumption, the celebration, and when you look at that seasonal round, we follow those things in the season, but just like a farmer, that everything that you're going and harvesting at those times, there's different language, there's different teachings related to that food, there's different methods, everything relates to those times too. So the language cues up with that and teachings cue up with those seasonal round and how we do things. Next. So when you're looking at food, the justice, it's related to the treaty. It has, because it's secured underneath that treaty, which is a superior law of the land, because most of the treaties were written before state laws, and in some cases before constitution, certain constitutional laws. They weren't all created at the time. So, because you have treaties started from way back in the East Coast all the way over, so they are superior laws of the land. These foods have to be sustainable, safe to eat, they're protected by that treaty. We have the ability to access them, celebrate, and share. Tamanwa is how we live our lives, and it is the lifestyle that we as Indian people live. We are governed by this throughout our traditions, our culture, religion, and how it relates to the land and how we see that. That is a quote from Armin Minthorn, who's the head of our longhouse. One of them, there's a few of them. And this is the way that we live our life. We cannot become hunters, fishers, gatherers if we can't go out and access that food, drop that deer, cut up that deer, take care of that deer, feed your family with that. You can't call yourself a hunter if you can't do every single one of those things. Just like a root digger can't do that either. That'd be like a heart surgeon saying, I'm a heart surgeon, without going into surgery, cutting that person open and making them live after they've done it. We are practicing our culture, our way, and as the Department of Natural Resources working to protect, restore, and enhance those foods for the land, fixing those ecological processes, and bringing those back to our tribe and our people. Thank you.
Are there any questions about any of the previous things and what we went through with some of the that are just hanging out there, and that if I or somebody from Nez Perce Fisheries or Wenix or Kathleen can answer, we can go find an answer for you? Anything that stands out, something that, no? Yes, Rob.
I've got a question on first foods. So the white man's favorite food is never served at the root feast that I've been to, and that's the morel mushroom.
Oh, mushroom.
Was that used as first food?
That is one of them, because that has always been there. That's one we love too. We go out together as soon as it starts popping out. And if it comes into the longhouse, yeah, they put it up, but that's when they don't ever come to the that one is like mushroom gold. People just don't, I've never seen it, but I have seen hip outs, like right now in the cottonwood trees. That mushroom that's growing right now, that one I see come into the longhouse, probably when you find it in big questions, but the girls, they don't like to share those.
Yes, Sarah.
You mentioned about, go ahead, Nick. private landowners now who are reaching out and saying, would you like to come on their land? Are you seeing that in this area as well as on the other side of the mountains?
So the one area, we were contacted by this rancher from outside of LeGrand, actually heading out. So LeGrand, Union, and Ashe are starting to make your way towards Baker. Right there, when you start to go up the hill, he has out, I don't know how much, I think it's a few thousand acres of land that he said, when I was younger, my grandparents used to talk about their people used to come up here and they would camp. And up above, he brought us way back. You actually have to have really good race to get in there. And you can't always get in there. And he brought us up to this place where there's springs. They're camping up on these old springs. We got up and looked at that land. We found 2 routes that we hadn't been able to find anywhere close to us. It wasn't just the couch. We have a lot of couch. It was couch. It was bitterroot. I believe there was loosh. One of the leaves, there might have been the one they call honey push, the little tiny one. I think she was there too. And then because of the way the land is, you have the yellow bells too, and that's my favorite actually. That was my favorite. I was just, what are we blast? Wave up this.
I wonder if Nez Perce Fisheries works on private land here, right? You have agreements with private landowners? Can you say anything about them?
Yeah, my name is Katie Fournier. I work for the tribe's watershed department in Northeast Oregon, Southeast Washington, project leader. So I'll speak for watershed, and then there's other people in the room that would have landowner agreements from the research perspective of fisheries as well. What we seek to do is work on private land with interested landowners to do river restoration, stream restoration, to help the recovery of illicit species such as Chinook salmon and steelhead. And so within that, we have access agreements to do the projects, and then we also have sometimes at the end of them permanent easements that allow us to continue to monitor and protect the projects in perpetuity.
Good.
Just to follow up on Katie, a lot of the research and monitoring work that we do is on private ground. And relative to some other areas in the west that I've worked in, we've got very good access here in Wallowa County. We run into roadblocks.
Yeah.
But overall, people have been pretty welcoming of having the tribe out there doing fisheries work.
Excellent.
And so we've been going like, what we've been doing is when we get to that place, we start asking those other questions of how did it feel, of, if that's something they would be interested in. And in some cases they are. We get a lot of calls from people wanting us to go back out there. And we do special agreements where, we'll have it so we have to present all the names of the people and we would take them out and make sure that they're brought in. We take out. The other thing that we have noticed is that once you get people back to an area where you're gathering, like that one area where you've seen where those windmills were, and so when they put those in the wind farm, the bitterroot was growing. It was growing good. It had a good crop. As soon as they started putting people on it, it tripled. And then it tripled again. And then they said since they've been out there every year, there's 3 times as much. It's because the way that we are taught to harvest. When you go out there, you're plucking the ground, you're turning the ground because the ground becomes hard like a rock. People going back to that's, we help with that process. And the way that we gather, you turn the ground, and then you take the tops of them and you put them back in the ground. And a lot of times when we're going out there is when they're seed too. So we're tilling, we're aerating, we're replanting. And as we move, we were always taught when we had your cup in, you swing it. And as you're walking and you're swinging it, you're hitting off the tops of those seeds and you're helping that disbursement. And then you don't just gather that one little area, you move across that land, you move across the ridge. And so we teach little kids that. And so when we go back to areas that haven't been touched, you start seeing the production of those start to increase. And so sometimes that's what people, and we have those, we help one another in different ways. And just like if you're going out hunting, you're pushing a herd. You're driving that herd, so they're not staying in that one area. But as you're hunting them, you push them, they scatter, they break up, which is good because if they're in a herd of 1,000, they stay that all year and they get sick, they're going to knock down a good number. But if you're moving them and pushing them just like a wolf does naturally, they push them 3 miles, they split them all over the place, and it gives all the vegetation in that area better chances because they're breaking them up into smaller, just like when you look at wolves, a lot of people don't like them, but if you look at it on the other end of it, it's making ranchers be better land managers like they used to, because a long time ago they used to go to those sites, they used to stay out there with their cattle, they fixed those fences. Then when they were out there, those cattle were breaking through those fences and doing that, and how many people get hit, how many people die on the road because cows are standing in the road. But now that the wolves are back, they're fixing their fences, they're having to move, they're having to protect them, they're having to move them around, and at the same time, those wolves, they attack, they take things that are easy, but at the same time, is that animal sick? Is there something wrong with it too that you might not smell, but that the wolf would? So is it making that herd, it might be taking out some sick ones, but is it making that herd healthier so when it does go to market, is that meat healthier? We have to ask all those questions, I think, and to look at that. It makes us all managers in different ways. It makes people manage their herds better. We have to manage them better, and how do we all work together? Because we have to, manage the wolves as best as you can. And, but they also manage cougars. The cougar populations are out of control. They are impacting elk herds, they're impacting other animals, but once you put another apex predator in, they help manage cougars, and cougars will help manage them because they fight each other, they don't like each other. The wolves will keep the cougars up in the higher grounds, and it's just only a matter of time before those cougars start taking that because every time we have people come out, we're seeing more of them. They're seeing more bears. We're seeing more big predators because we've done a good job of bringing them back. But you have to put the other one in. And once they start establishing, it's going to take us all work. But at the same time, those wolves are actually pushing those herds around, and so they're not impacting it. And what you start seeing dairy production, grass production, the production of the riverways. They start reestablishing and creating better, and we might not all see it now, but as we give it time, and then we're going to have to put some good, we're going to have to do some things of wolf management too, but we have to figure out how do we work it all together and balance them. It's all new. It's all new.
Good. Jeff?
Sure, I've got a question for Wenix, and I'll let her eat for a bit and ask you a question.
Okay.
So, we've had several presenters over the series who've spoken a lot about history, tribal history, Nez Perce tribal history, and some have referenced books and others have referenced oral histories. Could you give a sense of where that balance lies within Nez Perce culture of what's best put down and carried forward in a written form versus an oral form, and is that changing? Is that static? How do you... Well, and are there Nez Perce authors that contribute to the written form?
As it turns out, I just did a little essay for the Oregon Historical Quarterly. And the key figure in Nez Perce history in getting history from the Indian point of view was a guy named Lucullus McWhorter. McWhorter was a rancher who moved from West Virginia and lived in Yakima, was made a member of the Yakima tribe. McWhorter, the Nez Perce at Colville would come down to Yakima to work the hops field in the early 1900s. McWhorter met them, and then he walked, but one of them was Yellow Wolf, who was a participant in the Nez Perce War. And McWhorter walked the entire route over years of the Nez Perce War with Yellow Wolf. So the first book that came out, that came out that had an Indian side of the Nez Perce War, came out in 1940, was McWhorter. He then went on to interview Indians and published Hear Me My Chiefs. Those books are still available. So they're recorded by McWhorter, but they're the voices of Indian people.
His Yellow Wolf, isn't that the name of that book?
Yeah.
It's an amazing,
Yeah.
it's an amazing book. I really, there's so much stuff about my family in there. And through our teaching, even probably her teaching, the things that she probably heard from, or all of us that we heard from a young person, when you read some of those books, it actually sometimes puts things together in a whole, and you're like, oh, now I understand what they were actually trying to tell me. Because, it is coming from that voice and what they had to do following the trail. And even sometimes they got lost and they're talking about that, or just the amazing beliefs of our people and the things they carried, the powers they carried, because of the connection that we had to the earth and to those things. I mean, we knew things about nature, about land, and how to read it, because that's all we did. Now we have movies, you have songs in your head, we have all this useless information in our head that at one time we knew things because we were totally engaged with that at that moment. And I believe that some of our people actually have the ability to access more of their brain in certain areas, and that's where I think that we were able to access differently. And we have a lot of people still that are gifted.
The oral history, yeah, it lives still. And I think one of the comments about Alvin Josephi that Bobby Connor made, she wrote a little preface to a book I edited of Alvin's writing, and she said, something like, in the 1950s, when it was not popular to do so, Alvin Josephi listened to Indians. So he found Yellow Wolf, and he found that book, and the McWhorter papers are at Washington State University. And they're much more than the books, apparently. I'm not of them. But also, when Alvin started his work in 1951, there were 3 survivors of the Nez Perce War. And so he went to sweats with them. He talked to them. And if you hang out, remember when Alan Pinkham was here, senior, he's got stories handed down about Indians going to Central America. Now the interesting thing is you'll hear that story from Alan Pinkham, and then you'll go over and hear the same story from somebody on the Umatilla Ridge. Okay? So those stories get knit around by people. And that's why I think it's so important, and actually you and I were talking about people who live in an oral tradition. And I think that the Indian people, with all the crap that's been thrown at you over the years, and the trying to rub the brown off you and make you as white as possible, the ability to hang on to stories is what has been sustaining.
Yeah, I've got a question along the assimilation lines about military service among tribal members and the role that plays in communities, and also the motivations and how that relates to either carrying forth tribal morals and motivations, or assimilating to white culture, balance.
Yeah, we always revered our warriors, even back then, and they always had ceremonies for them. Before they left, they would do protection ceremonies, and then when they came back, they would do ceremonies because they're changed. People go to war, they see things, they're changed. And how do you deal with it? And there's things that are still passed on that they still do. But we honor all veterans, and that's always been a really, really big thing. I can't comment on that as much because I don't know enough about that to be able to even go there, but I know people that do. Like, that's definitely a really for me, a man's question that a veteran or somebody who really...
One of the quotes I heard very early from a World War II veteran was, it's our country we're fighting for. Our country, our land. So there was that. And I can tell you that, you know, in 1972, when there was all the uprising on the Rosebud Reservation, Alvin Giuseppe went out there to do a story on the Sioux, and he had a photographer with him. And he went out there and he said he saw a little kind of a hovel and had a Marine Corps 3rd Division sign on it, and went and knocked on the door and said, "I'm 3rd Division." And they sat down and had a great conversation. He said the photographer was so nervous that he got in the car and they started driving away, and he said, "I forgot to load the camera." But anyway, so that military tradition, you know, it's, and it carries over, you know. Joe McCormick, our good friend here, was a Marine, and then we also get the Marines and the Army and the Navy. It all gets mixed up in Indian land too. But I think that the fact that the attachment to place, the attachment to land, and you're trying to take our land, you're trying to take our place. Don't you think, Wenix, that that's part of it?
Yeah, there's a lot of people that serve, and I like, now when I look at it, just like for me personally, it's hard for me when I look at the different things from war because of why they're going there.
Yeah.
And the different political things, and I don't believe in everything. And I see our people, our children coming back, and they are so split.
Yeah.
They are, they're so destroyed that some of them don't ever come back. And they try to help them, and so for me, I'm always, when they're getting ready to go and tell the families, you realize that they are never going to do that. What you know them as now, they're never going to be that person again. They're never going to be that person again. And not everybody understands that, and the support you have to provide them when they come home. And some of them, they just struggle. It's hard. I don't like the war.
No.
I don't.
Indian people I've been around, the first time I saw, you know, the American flag being carried in along with the Beatles staff and everything, I was like, why? You know, this is a symbol of oppression.
It's our
this is a symbol.
land.
So then I always try to observe and listen to when I hear people talking about this, and I get that it is a symbol of the land. And also there's a huge, the warrior.
This has always been our
is
home.
huge.
Yeah.
We have no other home. This will always be
Yes.
our home. And everyone else sees, we will never leave. We will never stop fighting. We will never stop working to bring our culture back or bring these resources back, because this is who we are. And if we stop fighting, we lose all of this. Because this is our homeland, and it's been ingrained into us from the time we're born. Like I said, our DNA is different. When they've looked at him, it's different than other people. And the way we connect, and when we walk across the land, you can feel it. When I was driving, I drove by something, and I looked over, and I just got this whole jolt, and I was like, wow, what was that about? And when you're out there digging and gathering, all of a sudden it's like you hear things. You hear songs. Or when it's time to go out and gather and you start dreaming about sweat, or you see the roots coming, or sometimes maybe they might talk to you in your dreams. And they're telling you certain things about what you need to do before something. They talk to us in different, not everybody has different gifts in our tribes. You have hunters, skilled hunters. You have people that dream. You have people that they sing or they read, but there's something unique about them, and each family is different. And nobody's better than the other, because every teacher comes from small to old, because that little child, they might be with one of the most cultural, knowledgeable
families. And so your teacher, when you're walking on the ground, it might be a 7-year-old girl, because she could say, well, my grandma told me this is the route that you get and this is the reason why. And you got to remember that every person in your tribe has something unique, precious. And everybody's teachings are different, so we always have to listen to one another, because somebody knows something that the other doesn't. And so your teachers come in all forms. And you can't get that knowledge in books. You can't go to college for your culture. You can't get that from anywhere else. And I always say, you know, I went to school. I got associates, a bachelor's, a master's, but we need those people that never leave the Columbia. We need them to stay there. Don't ever leave. Just do that, because they are our knowledge. They're our culture's holders, and without them, our culture dies. And so we need all of us. We need the ones that can go out and can help educate on others. We need the ones that stay home, and then we need to figure out how do we get together and survive and bring that culture back. So it's just, there's so much.
Yeah, I think what threads through what a lot of people have said is that the whole difference between the relationship of humans to the land. Land is not a commodity that you buy and sell. Land and culture are tied together, as Wenix so well portrayed today. And I think that's a big, yes. Okay.
We have been taught that the Joseph Bend and the Nez Perce is from here where we live. We don't see Nez Perce people living here. And you know, we've been told about very many. Sorry. I just wonder, I don't know really how to ask this question, but I know there's the reasons of history that have taken people away. Like Albert and Veronica were telling us last week, they now have a new home, but is there an urge to have a home, more people have a home here in this county?
I think that's just, you know, man, they really did a good job on the reservations. They really did. I mean, because you know, we all went together. Our bands used to move. They used to travel and they go somewhere for a certain part of time, and then they moved down to winter villages, and then they come back up. And we were very nomadic. We moved. They moved with those food sources, and then you had some that had the permanent village. You know, they took us from the area. We all returned. We will not live up here, and actually there are families that are living up here. You just don't know. There are some families that are living in throughout here, and then, but everybody comes back. They come back a lot more. I've been up here probably like 7 times this year. I come up for different things, or I bring my family up for things. And when I'm not married anymore, but when I got married up here, I got married on the top of that mountain up there. My whole family, because my dad had passed, and this was a place that was special to him and my grandma. And so when I did get married, we went to the very top, my whole wedding party, because this place was significant then. And I wanted to be as close as I could to the spirit of them and my grandma. So I brought us to the top of the mountain, everybody who got married up there. So when we talk about the significance, sometimes we go to those places and we might not live there because, you know, on the res, I think you have the tribal government, you have the tribal community, that your community is there, your people are there. And you have a lot where people leave and come away, but a lot of them always come back. They might leave for a little while, or they go back to visit, or if they're not there, they're probably residing on another res somewhere else. We have some in the cities, but like I said, they kind of rotate back, or if they're living in other places, they're going back home as much as possible for different things or to other reservations.
I'd have to add, Janice, I moved here in 1971. There had been on and off some Indian people living here. People talked about it, what was his name, that worked in the mill here. You know, there were always a few people, and people would come up here and work the harvests. They would come from, I think they came from Umatilla, but definitely from Lapwing, and they would work harvest. Cy Whitman said that he came up and he said, that Mrs. Claggis could sure cook. And then he said, and then I came back with my rock and roll band and played in the Goldberg. So there's always been that amount of commerce. But also, I've got to tell you that in 1971, there was a lot of tension. Chief Joseph days, there were fights, and the teenagers would think they could pick a fight with an Indian. It was really testy. And if you look at that, that little assimilation thing, I got to tell you, it's about 1970 that things started turning around. But I think as Wenix pointed out so well, when you have generations raised in boarding schools and raised without their language and raised without their hair and all this stuff, it takes time for that comfort level and everything. So we see the Homeland Project, and wow, I mean, we've been going, for 30 years? And it's just gradually. So I think as it gets more comfortable, I hope that we have more people spending more time here, visiting more often and spending more time here. I think the fact that we've got enough of us now willing to listen and talk and sit down is maybe helpful.
Joseph has really changed.
Well, I remember when everybody fought each other, like our tribe versus Nez Perce.
Oh yeah.
Finally, it took me getting together with a couple of my cousins and getting us to all come down. And they come down for basketball tournaments. And finally, I'm like, you know what? We used to all hang out in huge groups. And when they all come over to my house, I'd be like, you know what? If you find my friends, you're leaving. And it took us a long time until everybody that fought with each, they finally became friends. And during that time, every time we come down here, they would all guys would fight the guys because they were talking to the girls, and then and then after a while, everybody became friends, and it took time even with our own people. And it takes time even when we do governmental things that we have to work together as best we can, but we all have sometimes those shared territories can be a hard thing too, so we have to figure out how to work better with one another. And because we're all a little bit different. So it takes us some negotiating and time and working with one another and sharing. I would love to see us have access to a site over here because we have shared territories. I would love us to. I want to be able to bring out the Umatillas and the Nez Perce because we have on shared areas to do excursions. And then I want to be able to do excursions with my Nez Perce Warm Springs and the Umatilla Warm Springs, and then Yakima and us, because we all have shared territories. And because we do have those lines, it makes it hard. You can't just go out with anybody to go hunting or fishing or do things, but we have shared territories. And we have Nez Perce kids on our tribe. We have Umatilla kids over there. How can we all come together and work together? So we're working towards that.
Jody, do you want to say something about that? No? I'm not putting you on the spot.
It's a hard conversation.
Yeah.
It's a hard one. It's a hard conversation. Sometimes we get along, and sometimes we don't get along, and it's a hard conversation.
I think I heard you say in your talk that very few people remain who can speak Cayuse.
None.
It's gone.
None.
Language died with our last speaker. And not only that one, the Wallowas too. The Umatilla is the only true one. We have the Umatilla, and then we have they're trying to hang on to the lower Cayuse Nez Perce. And we had that one language teacher is working with us. She's gone. They're trying to get someone else that has that part because it's like a Nez Perce Cayuse. It's a little bit different. And I know we have Phil Cash who's been really documented, and we're lucky to have him.
Yeah.
We're so lucky.
And that actually answering again something you talked about, Jeff, about the oral tradition. There's a new book. What's the name of it? The book about place names, Sahakian place names.
Oh, yeah.
and I can't say the title, but anyway, that book done by Phil Kashkas, Thomas Morningow, and a couple of other people.
Jennifer Carson, John
Jennifer,
Chesley,
yeah. So they went back, and again, through oral tradition, they went and talked to the elders from all over, and on words, sometimes they'll say, this word is also Cayuse, as well as Nez Perce. Now, there's an interesting thing on that. In looking through that book, do you know what the Nez Perce name for Joseph Creek is? It's Condor Creek. And there's a controversy about whether there were ever California condors here. Well, the name of Joseph Creek in Nez Perce is Condor Creek.
And when you go back to the places, that's the one thing, that those places are named for what was there.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
in that atlas, that is a small, tiny version of that atlas. They could do way more versions. When they first started that grant, I was actually working with all of them because I was doing the village at the time, and so I was in the office of all those language speakers. And it was true, I learned so much for the 3 years I was there with a group of language speakers. So they had people coming from the river, they'd all be talking, and then I just learned so many things. So many things. They'd be talking about some kind of a miscarriage, what they would do with it. I mean, just random things that I learned on a daily basis sitting in an office with speakers all day long. And then because I did the village project and we were trying to bring them out on excursions then and take them out to teach them how to do that. So when they were interpreters in the museum, they had to know firsthand. They had to be the ones that were preparing or doing the pits so they could actually be able to explain it. Because you can't explain it from a book. You have to have that firsthand knowledge. And we used to go out to those sites with them, and it was pretty amazing. And if we didn't know, we'd be like, what is that land formation? And we'd go back and we'd be asking multiple elders, and it was pretty amazing. But that's a short version of that atlas.
The Nez Perce were lucky in the 1950s. The Japanese linguist from Berkeley named Haruo Aoki came and started visiting elders and copying down stories. And so there is a full Nez Perce dictionary, Aoki dictionary. Well, I've got a copy, it's thick, and it's written in linguist script, so you have a little trouble dealing with some of it. But also there's an interlinear thing where he had elders tell stories, some of the stories that you're talking about, and then translate. So there's an and when Albert was here afterwards, he came over and he said, "You have a copy of this?" He showed it to his sister. So Aoki, who's still alive in his 90s, is at Berkeley, and he Beth Piatot, who's a woman who has been here and will be back at Fish Trap next summer. And Beth is Caldwell, enrolled Caldwell, but grew up in Idaho. And she has learned Nez Perce and met Aoki. So she brought Phil Kashkas and Dewey Davis and somebody from Lapwake to have a conference with Aoki last summer. And she's talking about bringing more elders together here sometime for a language.
Our language program actually is up there right now, and that is what they're doing.
They're
all up there right now.
At Berkeley?
Yes, they were posting pictures this morning. And they're like, oh my God, look at all this information. And so, Dewey Davis, is that who you had come down here?
Yeah.
So Dewey Davis, his grandmother and my grandmother are sisters.
There you go. Talk about big stuff. Pardon? Oh, yeah.
I'm just thinking it might be time for us to talk a little bit about the now what coming out of 5 weeks of class. So Angela Bombassi, I'm on the board for the Land Trust. I also work as staff at the Homeland Project. And just hearing Rich talk about all the opportunities for folks to continue this learning through the Josephi Center, through Fish Trap, also through the Homeland Project, through, of course, there's TAMCLICS. If you've never come, please come. A really kind of culturally safe, welcoming environment if you've never attended a powwow. if you kind of want to get your toes wet, it's a great opportunity to do it, always the third weekend in July. We also have a visitor center in Wallowa. We're in the process of fixing it up, modernizing it with the input of our board, which is made up of, including Albert Red Star actually, and other speakers that we've had here. But it's made up of tribal representatives from kind of the three major areas where Nez Perce people live, but also here in Wallowa. Rich is our chairman. And then, of course, Chief Joseph Days does have a feast as well. So that happens on Saturday. It's a chance to come experience a lot of these first foods, learn from the elders, and then, of course, there's also dancing that happens after that meal. So there are so many opportunities to continue to learn here, even if we don't get around to having another round of these workshops, but it's sounding like that's what people want, right?
We'll do more.
Yeah. So another question that has been coming up is why is the Land Trust been the organization to host this? What was the reason that was a priority for this organization specifically? And so I kind of wanted to talk about that a little bit. So we got funding, you'll see the funders on your evaluation. But we got some funding to focus on DEI. So for those of you not familiar, diversity, equity, inclusion. Diversity, I think, is the one that we hear the most about, which is just making sure that there's a breadth of representation in the work that we do. And of course, equity and inclusion, if you lack those things, your diversity may be lip service, but diversity really comes from not just equality, but equity, which is more around, are you maybe taking further steps to make sure that every group can participate, even if it means extra work for you? So one way that we've done that at the Land Trust is traveling to the various reservations just over the last 3 weeks to make sure that, one major obstacle for hearing from our stakeholders that are living on reservations is that they're far away. So we had to work a little bit harder to get that input by traveling to those places. And it was incredibly valuable, which takes me to inclusion. So inclusion it's more of a state of mind. It's about valuing and respecting what everybody has to offer. And so a tool that I've seen used is called the Cultural Humility Tool, or it's a spectrum. So every one of us individuals in the room, you may land somewhere on that spectrum. Your organization that you work with also lands somewhere on that spectrum. And, a person or an organization is not prejudiced or not prejudiced. You're somewhere in there. You're basing the way that you operate and you think, whether subconsciously or consciously, on biases that exist, on assumptions that you have. And those things aren't bad. We all have a bias. If you're a Christian, you're looking at things from a Christian bias. Even just the way we think about time. There's the joke of Indian time. Well, time is really a bias. It's the way you might think of it. But when you talk about inclusion and respecting other people's approach as being just as right as yours, who set this clock? And is that the most important thing? So that's why inclusion is a state of mind. And I just wanted to make sure that, as we're going back to work and thinking about what you learned here, you were educated in some way. You learned facts. You also learned stories. And I'm sure everybody was kind of thinking about, how does this apply to me? How does it apply to my work? How does it change my perspective? But I think the idea is that it's bigger than education, is kind of where I've been thinking about it. Because no matter how many facts you have, if you're aware, that doesn't necessarily change how you're thinking about people. And if you have this idea of superiority or just sort of like a linear way of thinking, it's okay for you to think the way that you're going to think. It's also really important that you consider the other and how that other person might think. So that's where cultural humility, again, just recognizing that you're somewhere on the spectrum. You're working towards having more humility, meaning that you consider where other people are at, think about it, recognize it, understand that you will probably never understand, right? You can't educate your way out of that. You can't read books and talk to enough people till you totally get it. But just knowing that other people have complex stories, other cultures have complexity, that is just as relevant as the complexity of the culture that you come from. And applying that in your personal life, but also thinking about how can you do that within your organization. What literal steps can you take to help make sure that what's important to other people is considered. And when you're trying to apply those things that might be important to those other cultures that are tied to the work that you do, are you doing it in the way that they think is right, or are you doing it in the way that you think is right? And trying to find that balance where you're considering the other and their process as you're finding solutions, so that the solutions will actually work for everybody. So that's kind of, to tie back, that's why we wanted to do that, bring this to everybody. It was only supposed to be for our board, but we recognized that all of these organizations, if we're all thinking that way, if we're all in this state of mind together, we can get a lot more done.
Yeah. I just want to get on my way. But I love that you brought this up, because there's another kind of opportunity that isn't specific to tribal history or what we can learn from listening to each other with the Nez Perce, that has to do with these concepts of cultural humility and just learning to look at ourselves and learn things about ourselves and think about what we learn and the implications that has for our organizations. And those are trainings that my organization, Northeast Oregon Economic Development District, has been bringing into the county about every 3 months. And we're going to continue to do that. So if you want to be part of more conversations, and everything we've learned in the workshops informs what we might talk about in these concepts, right? So if you want to be part of those, I would welcome you to go to our website, which is just neoedd.org, and sign up for our newsletter. It's short. It will always tell you when those things are out.
Okay. Wenix has to leave, so before she does, I want us all to thank her very much for her presentation.